better than having a Raven here, so I'll just deal with the fact it's not perfectly designed there. This is the invisible work behind OpenStack. I think I'm loud enough I can set this here and it still pick me up, so I'm not going to hold that. Most of you know who I am. I'm Faulkner. I'm an open source developer for G-Research open source software. I host the Gross Out podcast if you're ever looking for open source content, talking to people who are influential in open source or just having fun stories. If you like the hallway track, come listen. That's what we try to emulate. I've been working on OpenStack as an operator, developer, contributor since 2014, including launching the first public cloud on bare metal OpenStack. I'm also a Gen 2 developer, but let's get into it. And like I said, I may not even hold y'all here the whole time because this is going to be pretty straightforward. I think a lot of you are going to understand this. So we're talking about the invisible work behind OpenStack, so that means we kind of have to define what invisible work is. And I thought about this for a while, but I think that invisible work are sort of essential things, essential work or tasks that may not necessarily get the respect or treatment as an essential task by someone in the community, user base, or supporting companies. The someone's really important here, actually, because it would be a fallacy to think that like all of us don't have our own blind spots. So what do you do to kind of identify these invisible problems? Well, the first thing you just kind of, what is it? You kind of have to ask yourself, when will like this debt come due? And I'm not saying technical debt, even though that's kind of implied there, because there's a lot of invisible work that's not technical. But, you know, just like anything else, if you get a backlog of things to do, it's going to stack up, and there's going to be a time when there's going to be a reckoning about the work that hasn't been being done that needs to. Then we have to identify who it's invisible to. In that case, when I sort of think about that, I think about, you know, there are some things that might be invisible to someone who's an OpenStack operator who's not involved in the community generally. There might be, you know, I'll raise my hand and say I have a blind spot for certain parts of the OpenStack. I learned the names of all the OpenStack telemetry projects today for the first time in 13 years. So, you know, we all have our blind spots. There's not a single person or single thing to blame. And in fact, I'm gonna get on myself with the failure example here later on. And then you kind of have to identify why is the work invisible. And we'll have an example, a couple of examples later on where we'll go through this. But once you've identified it, you kind of have to evaluate it. You kind of have to think about what action can I take to fix this. And it requires addressing a few items at a basic level. So one of the things I wanted to mention before I even get too deep in this is that if you're a person right now who is one of the pillars that are standing up, that invisible work, helping hold the infrastructure up, note that sometimes maybe the right action for you to do isn't to work harder, but it's to work less hard. Sometimes the answer is to that you have to let things rot a little bit in order for some of those consequences to start bubbling up. And that's why we kind of ask these questions. So, you know, how much work is it? How much work does it take? How much work would it take if we had done it ongoing instead of gathering all this up? What damage has been or will be done if this work continues to not being done? Who needs to pay attention, or maybe who needs to invest time or money to fix this? Because I want to make sure this is not oriented toward individuals. I think that for the most part, every individual I've worked with in the OpenStack community has been dedicated. They've had things that they care about. They've been concerned about others. And this really is just a structural thing that emerges from communities of our size. And the most important thing is the last one. You have to either do the work or remove the need for it. If you have something that's in this middle spot, that's in this limbo, the status quo is the least correct thing that can happen. You really have to make an effort to change that status quo and either make the work more visible, make it effectively prioritized, improve the situation, or just discard whatever that invisible work is, so that we can be honest with ourselves and with our users about what things we prioritize and we care about. Then once you kind of have that, you've sort of done the identification, communication is the next important thing. First, you got to kind of determine your audience, and this goes hand in hand with the idea of identifying who it's invisible to. Sometimes maybe that work is invisible to other developers, other OpenStack developers on the other side of the world. Maybe it's invisible to developers in general because you're an operator and we're not thinking about your use case. But oftentimes the audience is actually going to be a leader at your organization or others, because with these type of structural things that cause the invisible work, the only real way to get out from under it is actually committed effort. We don't want heroes. I explicitly do not want people to walk out of this talk thinking, I need to take a personal, exceptional effort to fix this, because these are structural things. So, you gathered all that information before. We talked about, what damage has been done, what damage will be done, what's the real risk, and you have to communicate that. You have to communicate those risks or that impact of inaction. Oftentimes, these sort of problems take the shape of the sort of thing that's very easy to ignore, and the consequences are kind of off a cliff, where you're not seeing a steady decline. You might see a day where you wake up and something terrible has happened. But we'll talk about the terrible stuff later. But first, let's talk about a success story. And this is kind of at the top of minds a lot at this summit, is Eventlet. And I'll admit, I'm tempting fate a little bit to say this is a success story. It's still in progress across much of OpenStack. But honestly, a success story in terms of making invisible work, not invisible, is more about making the project itself visible, making sure that there's an awareness of it, make sure that there's actually dedicated resources and a committed plan to resolving it. And from this perspective, the plight of Eventlet is not really invisible to us anymore. People are aware of it, we know it's a risk, and we're actively working to fix it. So how did we get there? Well, we identified it. What was it? Well, we identified that Eventlet's not maintained, and it's unlikely to support new Python paradigms. Like, even if we're able to make it work on the newer versions of Python, each release that went forward, we were losing some package. And something else that we identified actually when we dug into this is that Eventlet itself was at extreme risk of being completely unsupported, in which case the consequences would have been even greater, because we might have had to hard fork Eventlet or do kind of a forced immediate migration instead of the planned out purpose we're doing here. And so when does that risk occur? Well, every single new Python release that occurs while we're still depending on Eventlet presents a risk that we're going to have additional issues, that we're going to have performance issues, that we're going to have functionality issues, that quite frankly, the way OpenStack works is going to be that much more different than the way the average Python program works. So who is it? Well, this is an interesting one, because I feel like the plight of Eventlet, the state of the ill maintenance, is sort of, it was invisible in plain sight. There would be a lot of developers or operators who knew that it was not a well-maintained piece of software, but I don't think anyone really understood the full breadth of it until the time was taken to really dig in and say, what are our actual problems? And this is kind of a clear example of things that are maybe invisible by design. Libraries are there to abstract details. The reason we use external Python libraries in OpenStack is so that we don't have to solve that problem. Someone else is solving it for us. That's the open source ecosystem at work. But OpenStack has a lot of support. We have a lot of developers. We have a lot of companies supporting us. And so it's important for us to sometimes take a look, dig that step deeper, and find the work and make it visible, even if the default and the easy path is not being visible. So what was the approach when we sort of identified the issue and went to fix it? Well, how much work? Well, we defined all the OpenStack projects would have to remove it. But also in the meantime, Eventlet needed basic maintenance. What would occur? Well, like we said before, eventually Python's going to be too incompatible with Eventlet for it to be usable. And we're sort of approaching that point already with the Pi release of Python that just came out. Who needs to help? This is an all hands on deck situation. This isn't something where one person or one company can take it on. This is going to be everyone who contributes to every project is going to have some sort of awareness of this, and quite frankly, it's even down to operators as well. We just released Ironic without Eventlet, and we did as much performance testing as we can, but we're also asking the community to please do some testing too. And so that's part of the help. You're all a part of the team, whether you've ever written a line of code for OpenStack or not, when we solve these type of problems. And so should we do it? Of course. I want OpenStack to continue. I want to keep paying my mortgage. We all are invested in this ecosystem, so it's pretty clear. And then how do we communicate about it? Like I said, I'm actually the person who did the communication here, but don't worry, I actually have a counterexample where I dropped the ball as well coming up next. And in this case, we recruited experts. In my case, I took like core Python expert that Gross has contracted out before, and asked them to really break down this perception of scariness and really identify the specific technical issues that was going on. And that fed in as an entry to a business case, which was mailed to the mailing list. I called it a director-ready email because my hope was when I sent that out, that if someone was working at an OpenStack contributing company, that they would read that and they would go, I need to get someone at my company to assign resources for this right away. And it worked. We have multiple follow-ups. Red Hat dedicated significant resources to do it. And the teams, the individual project teams, have committed to a timeline to fixing it. And so this to me is sort of a win. So just to break it down, the specific actions we took, we had some community actions, creating that summary, creating that business case and sending it out, disseminating it, providing the context to people who might not be able to fully understand the technologies involved. The type of people that decide at a high level the priorities for a development team at a corporation might have more business skills than technical skills by design. That's not a bad thing. That just means that part of our job is helping that translation layer. We had to ask for and receive access to the Eventlet GitHub repo. That was literally a several months process of working with these people to get access, and eventually we have dedicated developers who are now essentially ushering in a shutdown of Eventlet for the entire open source community, providing off-ramps, providing documentation. If you haven't seen it, just search for Eventlet removal. I think it's like removal.eventlet.org. I'm not 100% sure, but there's a lot of blogs, case studies, and this is a case that I'm actually really proud of what we've done as a community, because OpenStack being a large project, the fact we had 500-600 contributors in the last release means that we have a lot of weight in this space, and I'm proud of the fact that if there's other projects that are smaller than us that are still using Eventlet, that we helped create that. And the other thing that I think is really important is we set a deadline for completion. There's a time when all these projects have to be out or else they're not going to get released. So this is actually very important because it adds that little bit of time urgency as well, and quite frankly, it turns up the risk a little bit, because if you're a company that relies on, or you're an individual that relies on a specific OpenStack project continuing to exist, that gives you a vested interest in putting it. And it's not meant to be adversarial per se, it's just an acknowledgement of the forces that happen. You've got, if you've got a free lunch, you're not gonna go buy one. And that's kind of the deal there. But there was also technology too. I mean, we fixed some urgent Eventlet bugs that were blocking support for Python 3.12 and sort of made sure to push out the most severe of the consequences. We have folks who wrote compatibility shims that allow you to run async IO loops and Eventlet loops side by side, which has been a boon for some people. I don't think we've really used it in a lot of our OpenStack migrations, but it was a good example of how we put creative ideas out to do it. The OpenStack libraries were updated for use without Eventlet. The Oslo team may be one of the more invisible teams in OpenStack. They did a lot of really important foundational work that hopefully the majority of you in here who aren't OpenStack developers don't have to ever think about, right? Like updating services to work right, updating the various tooling and things that everyone shares to be able to support this new paradigm. And that was a lot of work. And right now, as I said before, the majority of project migrations are underway. Ironic and Barbican released Eventlet free in 2025.2 Flamingo, which I'm very proud of. But here's the thing. This doesn't sound like a lot. When you go through it, it feels like it's not a lot. The entire story here spans 2 years. When that initial email was sent, when that initial alarm was raised in the TC channel and someone said, we might not be able to have Python 3.12 working with Eventlet properly, that was almost 2 years ago, and we're still ongoing. And that's the other thing to remember about this, is that even though these items can have hefty risk, and hefty risks that can remain hidden until the last possible moment, that we still have to start as early as possible, because it's not easy to move this entire project in the same direction at once. So why are we talking about this now? Well, the theme of this conference, at least a lot of the sessions I've been in, the keynotes, everything has been data and digital sovereignty, ensuring that you own your own destiny with open source. But if you're relying on people you may not know, who you may not engage with, who you don't have any control or insight into other priorities they might have, or maybe even live in different jurisdictions. I live in the US. I don't want to be the only person in the US doing anything at this point. I want people in the EU to help me, to protect me, and to protect them. And if you don't have that diversity, if you don't have your own interest represented in a lot of these invisible places or a lot of these neglected places in OpenStack, then you don't really have that much digital sovereignty at all. Because how do you know that the security bugs are getting handled? And some of this, and this is sort of why I said earlier that the status quo isn't okay, a lot of this is about keeping promises to operators, about saying things, we promised you 18 months of support. In order to make that actually happen, we have to have that level of foresight. So what follows is, quite honestly, probably the least pleasant situation I ever found myself involved in OpenStack, and it's every security engineer's horror story, and it was caused by work, or in this case, the lack of work being done, being completely invisible. So imagine if you are not the person who's sitting in this conference room here today, but imagine you're just a deployer. Imagine you went to openstack.org, you downloaded it, you followed the doc, and you're one of the thousands of people who are using OpenStack who I might not never have a conversation with. Imagine what happened if you hear about this. And that's our failure story. OSSN OpenStack Security Note 93 relating to Murano. If you don't know this story, it is the closest thing to an open source horror story that I'm ever going to be able to tell. And I'm going to be honest, I'm sort of surprised that in this situation we didn't experience significant reputational harm. And that's only, quite frankly, I would say sheer luck that that didn't happen. So what was it? What happened? A security researcher identified a major vulnerability in YACL. And YACL is an OpenStack written library that's used by Mistral, Heat, and Murano. And this is one of the most severe vulnerabilities I've been exposed to in my time at OpenStack, where someone could upload arbitrary Python code and have it avowed in the interpreter. It's really bad. But of those 3 projects that involved, only 2 had enough active community contributors with the capability to fix the bug, and that was Mistral and Heat. And so what happened? Murano had no contributors whatsoever that were able and willing to fix the bug. So let's talk about identifying it. What wasn't done? What was missed? Murano needed normal maintenance to remain as an OpenStack service, but it broke, and that tech debt became due when there was a significant software vulnerability, and we did not have volunteers who were willing or able to take the efforts needed to fix that. Who could have prevented it? And this is where I say that I take credit for this. This all happened on my watch as TC chair. And that's part of why I take it so personally, because governance processes should have identified this. We should have had the proper processes in place to identify that if a security bug happened in this piece of software, that it was likely not going to be fixed unless it was something very trivial. And why was it invisible? Well, I have stuff written on this slide, but I was talking to Jeremy Stanley, a fun guy, about this yesterday, and he said it in a more perfect way than I ever could, which is that if there's nobody in the community who cares about the project or is doing work on the project, that also often means there's no one in the community to raise their hand and say the work's not getting done. And it's very easy for the wonderful people who do some of this invisible work to not punish a project for not doing their paperwork. So everyone was kind of helping it along. Everyone was doing what they could to maintain the status quo in this situation, when maybe the better option would have been to break the status quo. So I'll note that this sounds really scary. I'll caveat it by saying we have almost 0 known users of Murano in the public cloud. So in this case, it was not only invisible to developers, it was also invisible to users. So while this is scary, while it sounds really bad, while someone could have written an article in the Register that roasted us about how this was handled, the reality is I don't think this actually had a significant impact on anyone's production environment. We got lucky. But our failure to remove it led for a failure of us to keep those promises to operators. If you were someone who had Murano deployed, it was summarily retired. Do not pass go, do not get any of your long-term support, don't get any patches, it's just gone. And it's gone forever. So that is what bothered me the most, because when I was an operator operating OpenStack clouds, I relied heavily on those promises to make my decisions. And so now, as someone who was in a position to be a steward of that promise, dropping the ball, it was really unpleasant. So what do we have to do? Well, I've already already talked about, the sort of technology thing. We immediately retired Murano, and we issued an OSSN 0093, which basically is a CVE saying it's broken and we didn't fix it, which is not really present. And quite frankly, OpenStack sometimes can have a negative reputation of being an older piece of software. And when stuff like this happens, even though you and I know that's not true, we have a huge, vibrant community. We've got new features going in every day. But this is a hook for those people to get in and say, see, we told you. So on the community side, there was a refocus on ensuring project activity is sufficient to follow through with our support promises. And the TC has done a good job of promoting our new project inactivity framework and ensuring that projects that really aren't able to be trusted to keep their promises of 18 months of support, to keep maintenance, to do reviews if someone drops in, that those projects are getting labeled as inactive, which really is the time starts. It's really making that invisible thing more visible, where we're saying if you are a company that relies on this, if you're a person who relies on this, you have to take action now or else it's going away. And I think one of the other things that happened about this is, in practice, in the technical committee, PTL appointments for smaller projects had been mostly handled as a rubber stamp type of situation. We assume goodwill, we assume good intention, and we assume that you have the capability to do something if you volunteer. And I think at this point, if you look, when we do the PTL assignments now, when the TC does that work, there's a lot more due diligence coming in. There's a lot more people asking, are you qualified to do this work if it gets there? Because even if someone's well-intentioned, even if they want to help, we have to make sure that they're actually able to follow through on the promises that they're making in OpenStack's name. So why does this happen? What are the higher level pressures that drive these behaviors? And just do better as a solution is really a disservice because lots of people are doing their best. In fact, I would say, most people I know who work on OpenStack are just working their tail off. They care a lot. And in some cases, that can lead to the blind spots themselves. But like I said before, this is structural. This isn't individual. We don't need heroes. We need to fix the structure. So what are some of the misaligned incentives or realities that happen in open source software that work against us? Let's kind of talk about that a little bit. And realistically, I don't think this is all just OpenStack applicable. I think everything past this is applicable to most environments. And the first is supply and demand. If you're given a choice between working on things that are invisible to your customers, as a product person, as a person who's trying to meet your goals of selling and keeping all your people employed, keeping the money going, and that's important. We agree that's important. There are tons of for-profit companies that employ my friends that have bought my house. This is important. We have to care about that bit, but when given the choice, you can work on the things that are invisible or you can work on things that are whiz-bang. You can work on things that are a slide in the presentation about how cool your project is. Those are going to get worked on. And that sort of leads to a thing where, especially in product-driven organizations, it's much easier to get contributions done that have a direct impact on the product or a direct impact on the bottom line. But most of these invisible tasks live outside of the system, where it's the sort of thing that you don't notice it when it's done. You notice it when it's absent, and usually only after it's been absent for a long time. And the other piece that goes with this is that work that's assumed to be done often gets neglected. And this is where I was saying earlier that sometimes if you're the person who's the pillar holding up that little piece all by yourself, sometimes the best thing you can do is to let it fall. Because if you take away the supply of that work, then you're more likely to have a systematic approach to other people being willing to step in and take it up rather than getting the free lunch. That lack of perceived need reduces involvement. If you're getting the free supply of code and maintenance to meet your demand, you're less likely to prioritize contribution. And that has been true at almost every place I've ever worked, product-based or not, really. It's that justification is important. It goes back to making the business cases of before, of that some features, some projects make their own case, but this invisible work, we've got to step up and be the ones to make it. The other thing is what I'm going to call time erosion, which is that even for people who have dedicated time to this, either individuals or teams that have specifically carved out time for this work, there are always constant pressures to reduce the amount of time spent doing that invisible work. And And burnout accelerates when you're doing that unappreciated work on your own. I've seen that not just in myself, but in others. I've also seen at many companies that a downstream priority, an urge to get something done this week or this month or this quarter might override or derail an ongoing maintenance project that's necessary for the project to live on the 3-year horizon, not the 3-month horizon. And the other thing is something that one of my first ever DevOps managers told me long before OpenStack existed, which you can't spend too much time slaying dragons. You can't spend so much time fighting fires and not enough time slaying dragons, and writing your slides in reverse apparently. But you've got to take the time to slay those dragons and not just deal with the consequences as they come. You have to look at the root cause and root it out. The other thing I do want to note here though is that a lot of this slack, I think a lot more than people realize, are being picked up by open source developers who have a lot of personal care and pride in the project they work on. So much so that instead of seeing that work undone or shoddily done, they might take a weekend and do it, or they might take some time that they should be dedicating to their own professional development or mentorship of others to take that. And in that way, it erodes time in both directions. You can take time away from other things, take time away from your personal time, as well as just over time having that shared, let's make the community better, let's make the whole thing better time getting eroded back over time. One of the others is inconsistent contribution. And most of the invisible work is recurring. It requires steady, you have to be a tortoise. You can't just race from the beginning to the end. It requires a little bit of time over a long period of time. And a lot of the contributors to OpenStack, I would say the long tail of that number of 500-600 contributors we have every time are engaging with OpenStack to address a specific concern. They're pushing a specific feature they care about or scratching their own itch. And it's worth noting, and I'm going to caveat this by saying, I'm an ironic core reviewer, please push these patches despite what I'm about to say. But if you're doing that type of contribution, you're adding to the invisible work. You're not taking away from it. You might be helping the project as a whole by adding additional features, but you're adding to the code review load. You're adding to other things. So what's the other thing is I always think about this Eisenhower square when I think about this. And that's where, there are things that are important or not important, things that are urgent or not urgent. Almost all of the invisible work falls in that schedule a time to do it. It falls in that thing of it's very important, but it rarely comes with urgency. I call that in software development eventually. We'll do it eventually. And I very rarely seen eventually ever come. And in fact, that's the root cause of a lot of this stuff. So where can you help? And I'm just going to quickly call out a few projects that might be a good suggestion for places to sort of look at and see that maybe there's a small percentage of us doing work that's outsized in levels of importance. To me, this is the absolute shining star example of this. OpenStack ships a list of compatible library versions. That requires a huge amount of manual work to keep it updated and to make sure that those versions that we ship are actually up to date. This to me is a security time bomb waiting to happen. Because on the VMT, we get vulnerability reports all the time of people who say you're using a vulnerable dependency, and under our OpenStack security policies, that's not considered a security bug. The way to fix that is by ensuring that we either spend the time to do stuff like this correctly, or we stop doing it altogether. OpenStack vulnerability management. I work on security. I'm under US jurisdiction. The other primarily active VMT member is in US jurisdiction. A diverse geographic and company representation is important for digital sovereignty and to help us from getting burned out, and quite frankly, to protect us from our own government. I want there to be people in the conversation. And even if you don't have time to dedicate to the security team, this doesn't mean go join VMT tomorrow or anything, not by any means. But it means if you have a security bug in your project, be careful, read the docs very well, follow the process, and try to lessen that load. Don't accidentally offload that work onto someone else. And the other quality assurance are also the TAC SIG, the teams that manage DevStack, Tempest, the infrastructure it runs on, the tools that we use to test OpenStack. And when those are maintained and working well, I actually think this is an interest-bearing investment, because if the CI is working smoothly, everyone's able to work faster and it pays back. code review and creating a path to core. And this is sort of addressing two audiences. If you're a contributor right now and you're not a core reviewer and you're also not reviewing at all, I would ask you to reevaluate that, because it's very important. It's very useful to have people who are in there, who understand and who can identify things. But on the flip side, if you're a core, if you're a person who's a senior leader on a project, you need to find people who are new contributors, encourage them to do reviews, give them an on-ramp to becoming a core reviewer, because there are more and more OpenStack developers who are aging out or burning out. And if we don't do that invisible work of making sure to uplift the new generation, then we've got a time limit on it by definition. So I would ask that you prioritize code review, and that includes just asking questions about code you don't understand. That's fine, it's a great way to learn. For me and people on my team, I've always used a rule of thumb as an upstream OpenStack developer to try to spend 20% of my time reviewing code and unblocking other people. I know that's not possible for everyone, but we like to. There's also diversity in governance. And multiple times in the last few years, we've been at risk of having a single company majority technical committee. This is harmful even if you trust all the individuals involved, because those structural protections are there not just to protect us, but also to give a good perception of OpenStack as being a multi-corporate company. So, think about, are you a project that you work on that might need a PTL or a DPL volunteer or a TC? The other thing is money, because there's an interesting conundrum right now where, despite the fact that there are more code contributions from the EU, the vast majority of foundation funding comes from US dollars and US companies. This is an invisible kind of vulnerability in our system that hurts your potential for sovereignty. And so I know I'm at time, and I just want to say, only you can prevent code rot. You're the ones empowered to fix it. Go make a business case. Don't be a hero, but find that thing. Go have a conversation with your boss about dedicating an hour or two a week to solving one of these things. Or if you're in charge of one of these things, maybe ask the question of if it's better to not do the work at all and to retire something rather than do it halfway. There's no time for questions, I'm sure, but come find me if you want to talk about this. I've talked to 1,000 people at the conference about it already. If you want to hear me talk some more, I've got a YouTube channel with a podcast. We have an interview with Jeremy Stanley and Clark Boylan where we talk a lot about what OpenDev does, and it's really cool and relevant to this. So thank you all for your time.